What if the dish a Michelin-starred chef presented to you last year was invented by someone who was never allowed to hold a menu, let alone read one? What if the culinary traditions Europe called refined and elevated were assembled almost entirely from techniques, ingredients, and genius that came from people who received nothing in return? Not credit, not wages, not freedom. What if the true architects of Western fine dining were not the French, not the English, not the white-jacketed chefs whose names are on the doors and the tasting menus and the James Beard Awards, but the people history made deliberately invisible? The truth is, every one of those questions is provable, documented, and sitting right now inside the dishes the world calls classic. Stay through all 10. Because by the end, every fine dining menu you ever read will tell you a completely different story. Before the bowl even reaches the table, the smell has already taken over the room, something volcanic and ancient rising from a dark roux that someone has been building for 45 uninterrupted minutes of constant motion, stirring until the flour and fat cross the line from pale to amber to the color of old wood. Okra releases its silk into the pot. The whole kitchen fills with something that smells less like cooking and more like ceremony. Like something practiced so many times it has become ritual. Gumbo, Louisiana's signature dish. Most people will tell you, a proud Creole invention, French-influenced, born from the multicultural chaos of New Orleans' port culture, a beautiful accident of many traditions meeting in one extraordinary city. But gumbo is West African. The word, the method, and the soul of the dish cross the Atlantic in chains. The very name is the proof no one can argue with. Gumbo derives directly from king gumbo, the Bantu word for okra documented in West and Central African culinary traditions, centuries before Louisiana was a concept in any European mind. Enslaved women from Senegambia and the Congo Basin, arriving in New Orleans from 1719 onward, carried the okra plant and the thickening technique simultaneously in the same hands across the same ocean. French colonists had no framework for this cooking. They contributed the roux, a flour-based thickener, only after watching enslaved cooks build the dish's entire architecture first. The women who made gumbo for plantation households were never named in any recipe. The dish was so beloved it eventually entered the finest New Orleans restaurants, was rechristened Creole, and the inventors quietly, deliberately disappeared from the story. What remained was the flavor. What was removed was the credit. The most powerful dishes in history are the ones that survive the deliberate disappearance of the people who built them. The pasta pulls through a sauce so rich it coats the spoon before it coats the tongue. Golden, addictive. The kind of cheese sauce that should not technically be possible, the kind that makes you pause mid-bite because you cannot believe something this good exists this reliably. Baked to a shattering crust on top that gives way to something impossibly molten underneath. Macaroni and cheese, all-American comfort food. Thomas Jefferson's contribution to the national table, the story goes, brought back from his European travels. Proof of his sophisticated palate, his worldliness, his refined taste. Jefferson served it at White House dinner parties. He gets the credit in every cookbook that mentions it. But James Hemings made macaroni and cheese. Jefferson only ate it. That distinction matters more than anything else in this video. James Hemings was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson and trained as a French chef in Paris at Jefferson's direct instruction. 5 years of classical training, 1784 to 1789, at the Hôtel de Langeac. He mastered French pasta techniques. He returned to Monticello. He prepared the dish for Jefferson's dinner guests, who tasted genius and assumed without pausing that it belonged to the man sitting at the head of the table. Jefferson eventually offered Hemings his freedom on one condition, that he first train another enslaved person to replace him. Hemings accepted. He trained his brother Peter, was manumitted in 1796, and died in 1801 at the age of 36. The recipe that made Jefferson famous at Washington dinner parties was never once attributed to the man who perfected it. It is now the most consumed comfort food in America. James Hemings' name appears in almost none of the versions of that story. History has a habit of remembering the mouth that tasted genius, and forgetting the hands that cooked it. You hear it before you taste it. That specific crack of a crust built from technique rather than accident. The steam escaping in one clean exhale as the skin splits. Lacquered and audible, the sound arriving a full second before the flavor does. Fried chicken, a Southern American tradition. The story goes, comfort food, country cooking, a regional expression of simple ingredients handled with love. The kind of dish that feels so deeply American that questioning its origin feels almost rude. Almost. But the technique that makes fried chicken is West African. Scotland provided the fat, Africa provided everything else. The West African tradition of frying proteins directly in palm oil, documented in accounts from the Kingdom of Dahomey and the Gold Coast predating the 1600s, arrived in the American South with enslaved people from present-day Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria. Scottish settlers in the South contributed a tradition of frying in animal fat, which is real, and which is the one part of this story that usually gets told. What never gets told is that the seasoning philosophy, the marinating logic, and the crust-building technique that transformed fried animal fat into an art form were never Scottish in origin. They were African. Enslaved women were assigned the plantation kitchen and the frying station, the most physically brutal position in the house, closest to open fire in the most suffocating heat, and used ancestral knowledge accumulated across generations to build something extraordinary. White households then served it to guests as their own regional specialty. When fried chicken entered fine dining in the 20th century under the category of Southern cuisine, the black women who invented it were still being turned away at the front door of the restaurants that served it. A technique survives the people who invented it only when the world needs the flavor more than it needs to remember the truth. The pot smells like getting through hard times. Black-eyed peas collapsed into long-grain rice, perfumed with smoked pork and bay leaf, glistening with the kind of satisfying density that tells you this dish was not designed for special occasions. It was designed for survival. Steam curls from every bowl, Hoppin' John. A Southern New Year's tradition, folk food, superstitious ritual, charming regional Americana, the kind of thing food writers call humble when they mean they are not entirely sure where it came from and are not particularly troubled by that uncertainty. But Hoppin' John is a direct descendant of West African rice and legume traditions that predate American slavery by 1,000 years. The Wolof and Mandinka people of Senegambia, present-day Senegal and Gambia, cultivated cowpeas alongside rice as a dietary staple documented in Arabic scholarly records from the 11th century, 400 years before the first enslaved person arrived in Carolina. Carolina planters did not simply purchase enslaved people from the region they called the Rice Coast of West Africa by accident. They purchased them specifically because those people already possessed sophisticated paddy rice cultivation knowledge that no European settler on Earth held. The rice economy that made South Carolina the wealthiest colony in British America was built on African agricultural expertise that the planters took credit for and the history books quietly absorbed. Enslaved people grew the rice, selected the cowpeas, maintained the dish's logic through generations of plantation cooking, and watched it enter white Southern households as servant food. Then become a regional symbol, then a fine dining rediscovery. Every dish that crosses an ocean in the hands of the enslaved carries something immigration records never capture, memory encoded in flavor. Butter and brown sugar collapse into each other in a copper pan. You can see it happening from across the room. The sugars darkening at the edges, the banana slices softening and going lacquered and golden, and then the rum catches flame, and the whole tableside performance becomes theater. A controlled fire 3 feet from the seated guests who gasp slightly and feel that this is a very special restaurant. Bananas Foster, invented at Brennan's restaurant in New Orleans in 1951. The story says, a glamorous mid-century American creation. The birthplace of tableside flambe as a dining experience. Proof that New Orleans knew how to eat better than anywhere else. But the caramelization technique, the banana's culinary context, and the entire logic of this dish were built by enslaved sugar workers. Brennan's merely gave it a name. Caramelized sugar technique developed and refined on Louisiana and Caribbean sugar plantations. Enslaved workers managing open kettle sugar processing in Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, and Louisiana from the early 1700s onward, documented in plantation ledgers that recorded the labor meticulously while erasing the laborers completely. Bananas were cultivated and integrated into Caribbean cooking by enslaved people of West African descent who recognized the fruit's similarity to plantain, a staple from home, and immediately began cooking with it accordingly. When Brennan's invented Bananas Foster in 1951, they were naming a technique that had existed in Black Louisiana kitchens for 2 centuries. The tableside flame was new. The caramel knowledge was ancient. It came from people who were legally forbidden to own the sugar they spent their entire lives processing. The most theatrical moments in fine dining are almost always built on the quietest, most anonymous labor in history. And here is where this story gets complicated in a different direction entirely. The barrel releases something smoky and sweet, simultaneously charcoal-mellowed whiskey moving through sugar maple char, carrying a flavor so specific and so designed that you understand immediately you're tasting something someone spent years thinking about. Tennessee whiskey. Most people carry a version of this story that goes, Jack Daniel, a young white Appalachian entrepreneur, developed the Lincoln County process, the charcoal mellowing filtration that defines Tennessee whiskey, and built a distillery that eventually became the best-selling American whiskey in the world. That story is on the bottle. It has been on the bottle for 150 years, but Nathan Nearest Green was Jack Daniel's teacher, his master distiller, and the actual inventor of the process the bottle never once mentioned. Nathan Nearest Green was enslaved on the property of a preacher named Dan Call in Lynchburg, Tennessee, in the 1850s. He taught a teenage Jack Daniel the charcoal mellowing filtration technique that would define Tennessee whiskey globally. This is documented, not in contested historical records, not in disputed oral tradition, but in the Jack Daniel Distillery's own historical files, confirmed by researcher and entrepreneur Fawn Weaver in 2016, and publicly acknowledged by Jack Daniels in 2017, when the company officially named Green their first master distiller. 150 years after the fact, Green's descendants still work in American whiskey. The Uncle Nearest Distillery opened in Shelbyville, Tennessee in 2017, the first American whiskey brand, founded specifically to honor an enslaved master distiller, and won World Whiskey of the Year in 2019. The credit was stolen for a century and a half. It is now incompletely but publicly being returned. This is what correction looks like when an industry finally decides the truth is more valuable than the myth it built its brand on. The most authentic spirits are the ones that survived 150 years of someone else's name on the bottle, and are still here to tell you who actually made them. The wafer dissolves before you have fully decided whether you like it. That fast, that precise, sesame oil releasing something nutty and warm and slightly smoky from a flavor memory older than Charleston itself. The whole thing so thin it barely exists, and yet somehow manages to be addictive. The kind of thing you reach for again before the first one is finished. A Benny wafer, a charming southern coastal specialty. The story goes, a delicate low-country confection associated with old money Charlestonian hospitality, genteel and refined, the kind of food that appears at garden parties, and on silver trays and in the tourism brochures for cities that have complicated relationships with their own history. But Benny is the Wolof word for sesame. The seeds, the name, and the entire pastry tradition arrived from West Africa, not Europe. Sesamum indicum, cultivated in sub-Saharan Africa for over 3,000 years, was carried to South Carolina by enslaved people from the Senegambian coast, beginning in the early 1700s. Ben appears in documented Gullah Geechee foodways as both a culinary and a spiritual ingredient. The seeds believed to carry luck and protection from the homeland, planted near doorways and ground into cooking with an intentionality that was never merely culinary. Enslaved women sold Bene wafers in Charleston's open-air street markets, one of the very few economic spaces they were permitted to occupy. The wafer became so associated with Charleston refinement that it was absorbed entirely into white Southern hospitality culture over the following century. It appears today on charcuterie boards in restaurants whose menus describe it as a regional specialty without ever connecting the recipe to the Gullah Geechee women who built it into a tradition by selling it from their own hands in the street. The ingredients that people carry across an ocean are never just food. They are the parts of home that could not be confiscated. The pot smells like a revelation that took a very long time to arrive. Roasted peanuts ground into paste and added to a tomato base already volcanic with Scotch bonnet and ginger. The whole combination sweat-inducing in the best possible way. The kind of smell that reaches you before you've found your seat and makes the decision for you about whether you're staying groundnut stew. Most American food history credits George Washington Carver with the peanuts' place in Southern cuisine, a beloved scientist, 300 recipes, a story the education system has told with genuine warmth for generations. But West African groundnut stew predates American peanut culture by centuries, and the tradition Carver was formalizing was never his to discover. Groundnut stew is documented in the culinary traditions of the Bambara and Mande peoples of present-day Mali and Guinea, recorded by Arab traveler Ibn Battuta during his 1352 journey through the Mali Empire, 500 years before Carver was born. When enslaved West Africans arrived in North America, they recognized the American groundnut as a close relative of the Bambara groundnut they already knew, and immediately integrated it into their cooking using techniques that were entirely their own. By the time Carver published his peanut research in the early 1900s, Black Southern cooks had been building peanut-based cuisine for 2 uninterrupted centuries. His work was brilliant and his science was real, but the tradition he was naming already had authors, unnamed, uncredited, already long at work. The fine dining world eventually discovered peanut-based sauces and described them as global and exotic, having no idea the origin was in the kitchens of the people the South had spent 200 years refusing to acknowledge by name. The greatest myth in food history isn't that someone invented something, it's that we keep forgetting who actually did. The shrimp are folded into a butter and Holy Trinity sauce so deeply reduced it clings to every surface, tangled and glistening, the plate looking less like dinner and more like the result of someone spending a very long, very serious afternoon thinking about shellfish. Étouffée. The word is French. The butter is French. The restaurant culture that made it famous is French Louisiana, and the fine dining world has always presented this dish as evidence that Creole cuisine is, at its most refined, fundamentally European. But the smothered technique, the shellfish selection logic, and the flavor architecture are West African. The French contributed the name. Étouffer means to smother in French. But the technique of slowly smothering protein in aromatic fat and vegetable base appears in West African palm oil cookery, documented in 18th century accounts of Dahomey and Yoruba kitchens, predating any Creole restaurant by generations. Enslaved cooks from present-day Benin and Nigeria arrived in Louisiana and recognized its freshwater shellfish as a workable substitute for the crayfish and prawns of home, and rebuilt their ancestral technique using local ingredients with the pragmatic ingenuity that survival demands. When Creole cuisine was codified in the late 19th century by restaurant owners and cookbook authors, almost exclusively white, the African structural logic of the cooking was attributed to French influence, because French was the language of aspiration and African was the language of what the era wished to make invisible. The women who built the architecture of this dish were assigned the category of home cook rather than chef. That distinction has never been innocent. The cruelest thing a cuisine can do to its inventors is absorb their genius completely, and then call the result by someone else's language. The biscuit tears apart in horizontal sheets, not crumbling, splitting, the layers separating cleanly the way they only do when someone who knew what they were doing built them that way. The exterior shatters, the inside yields. The steam that escapes smells like the specific intersection of cold fat, acid, and heat applied with precision and speed. Buttermilk biscuits, the American South's most beloved bread, an Appalachian tradition, a British colonial inheritance, the grandmother's recipe passed through European settler bloodlines across generations of Southern home cooking. The narrative is so settled that questioning it has always felt to the people who carry it like questioning something close to family. But the lamination technique, the fat-to-flour ratio logic, and the speed-based method that makes Southern biscuits what they are, were built and perfected by enslaved black women, not European settlers. Plantation kitchen records from Virginia and the Carolinas, spanning the 1780s through the 1850s, document enslaved women as the exclusive makers of biscuits for white households consistently enough that the record is undeniable. Mary Randolph's 1824 cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, the first major American cookbook, the text that established American domestic cooking as a literary subject, drew its recipes directly from the enslaved women in Virginia plantation kitchens without attribution on a single page. The specific lamination technique that defines a Southern biscuit, speed, cold fat, minimal working, the aggressive cut-in that creates the layers, is documented in Black oral culinary tradition as skill passed mother to daughter across generations of enslavement. A technical knowledge preserved in hands when it could not be preserved in writing. When the fine dining world rediscovered the biscuit in the 2010s as elevated Southern cuisine and charged $14 for it at weekend brunch, it presented it as a recovered folk tradition. It never named the specific category of people who perfected it. The hands that built the biscuit were never allowed to sit at the tables the biscuit was served on. The most revolutionary act a stolen recipe can perform is to simply survive long enough for the world to finally ask who made it. 10 dishes, 10 names history tried to bury, 10 moments. Where the world sat down to eat genius, it had deliberately, systematically, institutionally refused to credit. Here's what all 10 of those stories were actually building toward. The greatest culinary theft in history was never about recipes. It was about authorship. Fine dining built its entire mythology on a foundation of unnamed hands, and the dishes it calls timeless, classic, and refined are timeless precisely because the people who invented them were too brilliant to be erased, even by the systems that were specifically designed to erase them. The table was always theirs. The world just never sent them an invitation. And the deepest truth buried inside every single one of these stolen dishes is this: you cannot erase the cook by renaming the dish. James Hemings is in every bowl of macaroni and cheese. Nathan Nearest Green is in every bottle of Tennessee whiskey. The unnamed women of Charleston's Benny markets are in every wafer that dissolves on a silver tray. They were always here. The question was never whether they existed, it was whether we were finally ready to say their names out loud. If you learned a name today that you didn't know yesterday, that is the entire point. Share this with someone who still thinks fine dining invented itself. Which one genuinely stopped you? Drop it below. And if there's a dish we missed, name it. These stories deserve every corner of the comment section they can get.